Hi, good afternoon. I'm David Sherman, the chair of Israel Policy Forum, and I can't thank you all enough for joining us on such short notice. Obviously, a lot going on right now. First, let me just say that Israel Policy Forum stands with Israel and Israel's security, and we're also extraordinarily grateful to the relationship between the United States and Israel and the rest of the countries that were so important with our regional alliances and helping with Israel's security and that of the broader region. It's really never been more clear about how important that is. Obviously, in the days and weeks ahead, Israel Policy Forum will continue to serve as a resource for policymakers and communities, and we're going to continue to provide credible, nuanced analysis through our written content, our podcasts, private engagements in Washington, and our public community programming such as this, and with all of our IPF ATID engagements, which focuses on our young professionals nationwide. I want to thank all of you because I know we have so many supporters on this call. Obviously, without your support, this would never be able to happen, and it's such a critical time. So thank you all so much. I want to flag a couple real quick pieces, but one specifically, and we'll be putting this in the program today, but a really outstanding piece by our very own Shir Efron, who's our Glazer Foundation Senior Director for Policy Research, whose latest piece was just published in Foreign Affairs, dealing with humanitarian aid and comprehensive analysis to date on what Israel might be able to do more effectively in that arena as we try and find a path going forward in Gaza. So I think we've already added it, but we will have that link in there as well. So I hate to say it, but once again, it's just amazing. Every week there's another topic, and this is a biggie. So we're going to turn this over to David Halpin, our outstanding CEO, and then to Amos. So David, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, David, and thanks everyone for joining us. We've had a number of opportunities to spend time with Amos Harel, the military correspondent for Haaretz. We've met with Amos on numerous occasions since October 7th. He's been a frequent guest of our podcast, Israel Policy Pod. We've met in Washington, we've met in Israel a few times, and here we are yet again, speaking after yet another unprecedented weekend. And as David said, it's one thing after another, but we really are in remarkable days and consequential days in terms of the security of the wider region after this real aerial assault by Iran on Saturday evening. Amos, without a doubt, you have been following this incredibly closely and engaging with Israeli officials. What can you tell us that you're watching at this hour in the aftermath of this weekend?
Hi, David. Good evening or good morning in your case. Thanks for inviting me. Well, more than anything else, we're waiting for decisions. Israeli response, not just the vocal response, but actual acts, properly acts of war against Iran. We'll see how this evolves, but there was a meeting of the War Cabinet, the most senior forum that deals with Israeli decisions. This afternoon, it's supposed to convene again tomorrow, I think by noon or something like that. And according to quite a few leaks, and perhaps this is the message that the Netanyahu office would like to broadcast right now, there is going to be a military response, whether that would be kinetic warfare or some cyber attack, whether this would be massive or rather limited in its goals, we don't know yet. It's quite clear that the Biden administration has signaled both publicly and privately to Prime Minister Netanyahu that the United States is not on board. President Biden told Prime Minister Netanyahu, you've had your victory, that's it, meaning you succeeded brilliantly in preventing the actual attack, because there were close to 350 missiles, rockets, and attack drones launched towards Israel, and hardly anything happened. And what the Biden administration would like Israel to do is to contain this and move on. I'm not sure that this is the way either Netanyahu or his partners in the government and in the war cabinet perceive it. And I think that for the time being, it seems that there will be an Israeli reaction. Would that necessarily be something that we've never seen before, a massive retaliation attack, which would necessarily lead to a regional war? I suspect not, but it remains to be seen. And we've been wrong so many times before during this war that it's very hard to tell where this is actually heading.
So almost before we get into the many scenarios of what may happen next that you're now referring to, I wonder if we could just take a moment to reflect back on what actually took place. We saw a rather strange series of reports that made this to be so highly anticipated. Not only that there would be a drone attack over a portion of hours once launched, but almost it seemed to the day that it was clear that this would take place. What do you make of, on the one hand, a very telegraphed attack, but on the other, a very large and wide-scale attack on the part of the Iranians that really was unprecedented? What do you make of the nature of the attack itself?
So there were a lot of conspiracy theories. People would believe everything by now, and it's the era of fake news in a way, and conspiracists. So a lot of people assumed that this was somehow prearranged, like a friendly match between the United States and Iran, and that both sides have more or less agreed, and as you said, telegraphed the message to Israel. That's not the case. I think what happened is that the Iranians actually surprised the Israelis. Israel never took claimed public responsibility for the attack against the Iranian general Hassan Mahdavi, who was killed in Damascus on April 1st. But Israel presumed that this would be the Iranian response would be somewhat similar to events in the past. This wasn't the case. The Supreme Leader Khamenei, on 3 occasions, threatened Israel with direct Iranian revenge, and it was quite clear that this is where the Iranians were heading. Then Israel started cooperating with its friends in the region, and mostly with the United States and some European countries as well, in order to prepare for this attack. By then, the Iranians started signaling messages that there will be an attack, but they're not going for an all-out war. They're going for mostly military targets, and perhaps I think it was understood in Israel that this wasn't aimed necessarily at population centers. Also, we had this time, unlike the tragic situation on October 7th, we had very good intelligence, whether it was by military intelligence, whether it was by Mossad, whether it was by the American intelligence community. Israel knew where this was heading, and this helped Israel prepare for this. And again, this is unprecedented. If we're looking for the silver lining or something optimistic to say about the very grave situation, then both the cooperation was amazing with the Americans and apparently with some Arab states, although again, Israel does not mention that publicly, but also the technological and operational response was very, very impressive. In the end, the public, at least the public messaging is that 99% of those projectiles were intercepted. I'm not sure if it's exactly 99%, but it's still very, very impressive. There were only 4 missiles, ballistic missiles, that got through the different layers of air defense. And even these missiles landed mostly in the vicinity of Nevatim Air Base. The original Iranian plan was more or less to wipe out this very strategic and important airbase at the Negev Desert, close to Beersheba. And this is where the F-35 squadrons are located. So this is a massive message from the Iranians. And it's not that they failed intentionally. They tried to hit the base, but failed. And so this is quite impressive. And yet, I wouldn't explain this by some kind of a prearranged kind of conflict between Israel and Iran. This is not the case. Iran wanted to send a message loud and clear. It felt that Israel crossed the line by assassinating the general in Damascus. It failed in actually achieving results, but still, it's the fact that the Iranians were willing to attack Israel in such force is something quite dramatic. We discussed that earlier before this became public. But going back to the first Gulf War in 1991, there were about 40 Scud missiles launched from Iraq to Tel Aviv, Ramat Gan, and so on. And this seemed like a very big deal at that time during about 50 days. It was from January 15th to the end of February. Here, within 10 or 15 minutes, such a massive attack towards Israel. Again, this is almost, it's an act of war. It's like a declaration of war from an Israeli perspective. And I think this helps us to understand why the Netanyahu government is so keen on finding the right answer to that.
Yeah, I think as some of you have already figured out, but we, of course, want to take as many questions as possible through today's conversation, and you can do so by typing your question into the Q&A chat, and I'm going to try to get to as many as I can, but just a couple questions while I still have you, Amos, because I think you began to talk about the Israeli response and the question about an appropriate response that might prevent a wider scale war, and yet at the same time, you know, as you rightly just noted, Iran was attempting to take out an airbase. Clearly, this is a declaration of war that would have demanded a very fierce response. The fact that there was a failure to create any significant damage is why we're even having this conversation about the considered and measured
Exactly.
response than a response having already taken place. So what are the factors right now in the Israeli decision-making in the hours ahead and days ahead vis-a-vis international pressure and the international coalition versus, and as well as capabilities? What are you watching in terms of the decision making, and what do you think the options are that are on the table?
So we've mentioned the relationship with the United States, and after a very long time, this was suddenly going very well. There was great cooperation. General Kurilla, the commander of CENTCOM, came here, I think, on first day and stayed for about 3 days to coordinate the preparations for confronting the Iranian attack. Biden was on board. The president was on board as well. The administration was very, very helpful. And now, after fighting with the Americans for 4 or 5 months regarding Gaza, this is quite a change. In order to keep it that way, you know, to some extent, you need to continue coordinating. On the other hand, it's no secret that there are differences in the way Israel sees the Iranian attack and what the president is saying, either publicly or leaking to the American, or briefing the American media. So again, Israel would have to tread lightly here and to find the right path. And on the one hand, to secure deterrence or resume deterrence against Iran and perhaps the Middle East at large. And on the other hand, not to fight the United States over that, because Israel needs American and European support. We're the good guys again. We somehow managed to lose that role tragically within 2 months after the horrific massacre of October 7th. But right now, we have international legitimacy. It was the Iranians that attacked Israeli soil. It endangered Israeli civilians, although only one young girl was injured severely. And this is, again, as you said, this is an act of war. This is a very massive attack by the Iranians. So you need to keep that support. You need to keep a level of coordination. And on the other hand, you still want to make a point to the Iranians and make sure that they don't cross this again. Because if you look at a worst case scenario, in the long run, this could become something like Ukraine. We haven't mentioned Hezbollah yet and its role. Perhaps we'll discuss that later on. Hezbollah has been fighting a war of attrition against Israel since October 8th, a day after the Hamas attack on the South. And this has caused quite a headache to the Israeli decision makers. And now you have Iran involved as well. What if Iran decides to launch a small attack, send 2 ballistic missiles and 5 attack drones every other day to Israel? This would be something else to deal with. It reminds you to a certain extent to what's happening with Russia and Ukraine as well. Will we have to face something like that? That would be quite dangerous and problematic for us. This would be a huge strategic headache. So we need to find a way here to deter them and prevent Iran from reaching such a situation. Then there's a matter of capabilities as well. Israel, I would presume, would prefer to avoid a full-scale confrontation with Iran. We're busy with Gaza. We hardly mentioned Gaza, but this war started with this massacre on October 7th. And as you know, more than 250 Israelis were kidnapped still 133 hostages are held against their will in captivity in terrible conditions, and many of them are dying on a weekly basis in Gaza right now. So that was top priority. Then we have to deal with the situation up north. 50,000 Israelis had to leave their homes because of the Hezbollah attacks. If you add Iran to this never-ending list of military missions, then perhaps it's too big for us to swallow all of this, to handle all of this at the same time. So I think the Israeli path forward would be to find somehow a way to deter Iran, not by just intercepting its attacks on the one hand, and not getting carried away into a full-scale war with Iran right now. On the other hand, if we look at the Iranians in the last 40 years, it's quite clear that they were risk-averse for a long time. Anybody who's been following Iranian behavior, they prefer to stay behind the scenes, to send their proxy forces to make Israel pay and to attack Israeli and sometimes Jewish targets around the world, while not actually having Iranian casualties. This goes back to the Iran-Iraq war of the 80s that lasted for 8 years, where they lost 200,000 people. They're still traumatized by that period, and they still want to avoid that. Leadership are all veterans of that war, and they would like to avoid a full-scale conflict with so many casualties. So to some extent, I'm not sure that we're searching for a direct confrontation. Having said that, the fact that they decided to act, it's not only a matter of Israel crossing a red line from their perspective, it's also, I think, their assumption that Israel is suddenly weaker, that you can mess with Israel, so to speak, because after everything we went through last year, the judicial overhaul and the huge tear in Israeli domestic politics, on the one hand, and then the tragedy of October 7th. And we have to admit that we were surprised. We took a massive blow, and this has been broadcasted all over the Arab and Muslim world. I think many forces, hostile forces to Israel, felt that if Hamas could do that, they could try something against Israel as well. So we need to somehow convince the Iranians that this was a mistake and that they shouldn't go forward with another miscalculation. And a lot of this depends on what happens between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu right now.
And we've seen a lot of reports thus far about the American desire to see de-escalation, strong, really unprecedented support for Israel's security and defense from these attacks, but clearly concern about an offensive that could expand into a wider regional war. There was a report that suggested this phrase that Israel should take the win of this remarkable victory of repelling this attack, and maintain the coalition for another day. I wonder, is that in the cards? Do you see any scenario where Israel essentially takes the win and does not retaliate in any sort of offensive way?
I doubt that, because of most of the statements being made today. We just heard Chief of Staff of the IDF, General Halevi, visited Nevatim, the same airbase I mentioned earlier, which was the main target of the Iranian attack. And when he spoke with pilots and technicians there, what he said was that, let me quote him for a second, because it was just sent. Where is it? So the message from Halevi was this launching of so many missiles, rockets, cruise missiles, and attack drones into Israeli territory would be matched with a response. So this is quite a clear statement, meaning that Israel would retaliate. Will that be cyber? Will that be kinetic? How massive would it be? How soon? How urgent? It's hard to tell. But everything is broadcasted according to this message. It's even more interesting than that. It was 2 o'clock Israeli time where the missiles were launched. The drones and the cruise missiles were launched earlier, but it takes a longer time. So by 11 o'clock, close to midnight on Saturday, all Israelis knew that something like this was going to happen, and people stayed awake. It was there was quite some tension. It's strange because it took time. The IDF actually announced that there were drones on the way to attack Israeli soil, and that it would take a few hours. Then the ballistic missiles were launched, and that takes 12 minutes from Iran to Israel, and then they were intercepted, most of them. So by 2:15, it was clear that this was over, that there were hardly any casualties, and that Israel has escaped massive harm. Then on 2:30, well, still most of the nation is still watching Channel 12, which is the biggest TV channel in Israel. A correspondent, a political correspondent who's known to have very good ties with the Netanyahu office, quoted some senior diplomatic source, meaning Netanyahu himself, of course, saying that this is not over yet, and that he would recommend for people to stay awake this night in order to witness the massive Israeli reaction. This didn't happen, of course, and it was not only this reporter, but others who are known to be close to Netanyahu repeated that message. Why didn't it happen? I assume because of the phone call from President Biden, and I assume that Netanyahu was forced to delay at least by a day or two. This is not only about disagreements, it's about operational problems, because if there are so many American airplanes between Tehran and Tel Aviv, the Americans needed to get out of the way before Israel does something in order not to be perceived as taking part in the attack against Iran, and of course in order to prevent all kinds of mistakes of Israeli planes, God forbid, shooting American planes by mistake and so on. But the fact that this is delayed doesn't mean that this is out of the picture completely, out of the question. I think that it will happen to some extent. My personal hope is that it won't go too far, and here is where Hezbollah enters the equation. I hope I'm not spoiling your next question, but Hezbollah is a massive issue here because there's a paradox. We keep hearing about Iran. Iran is, of course, financing terrorism all over the place. It sees itself as a regional superpower and so on. And yet Hezbollah right now, paradoxically, is more dangerous to Israel's security than Iran. We've seen that we can handle Iran more or less with American help and so on. Hezbollah has 160,000 rockets, and it's next door. It's in our backyard. And if it decides to join in on a massive scale, this is a whole different ballgame for Israel. Now, it's not Hezbollah's decision. In the end, it's Iran's decision. So let's take a scenario in which Israel has a massive operation against Iran. Iran has financed and built Hezbollah's rocket arsenal for the last 18 years or so, I think ever since the end of the Second Lebanon War in 2006, for a situation in which Israel decides to strike Iran's nuclear sites. But if Israel strikes other sites in Iran, and this is massive, then there may be a response from Hezbollah, and that would mean something much more devastating than anything we've experienced before. I still think that Israel would win this in the end, but the massive damage to the home front would be something that we've never witnessed before. So this is when we have to consider, A, are these the original goals of the campaign? We wanted to release the hostages and defeat Hamas. And B, what are the consequences for the Israeli home front, for Israeli towns, cities such as Haifa or Tel Aviv? Then, if you want to go and attack Iran right now, okay, it's possible to do that, but you need to think of the possible consequences. This is more or less the situation right now. Look, I can't be envious of Netanyahu or Eisenkot or Gantz or Gallant's situation right now. Look at the pictures. They're making a mistake here, but they keep on publishing those photos and videos, very short videos of the war cabinet meetings and so on. And sometimes it's just photographs. Everybody seems extremely worried. Look at the faces. They're not defeated, but they're concerned. These are life and death decisions. It would mean the life and death of many Israeli soldiers and civilians if you take the right path or not. So this is quite a serious situation right now, and it only got more complicated after April 1st and after the Iranian reaction on April 14th.
Yeah, and I think this idea of enacting a response or there being a price, it's hard to see what the strategic endgame or the strategic goal here, other than reestablishing deterrence, which is a very subjective, uncertain a goal
Mhm.
in terms of how things would be interpreted. I wonder if you could speak a bit about how the situation in Gaza does, how things would be different if there was not this situation in Gaza, or how it's impacting the current considerations and decision making. One question I'll add to that is, the notion now that the Americans very much want the Israelis not to escalate. One would assume the Israelis have a lot of requests of the United States to ensure security going forward to prevent any wider escalation, and would use that to their own advantage. I'm curious, do you expect that this sort of give and take of diplomacy between allies around using leverage and aligning goals and all the rest, given the multiple fronts that we now see in front of us?
Yeah, so this is interesting. In the end, Israeli generals were preparing for the last year or so. It had to do with the judicial overhaul and the domestic crisis as well. But also, there was a lot of talk of this multi-front future war. And if you remember, Salah Harouri, now deceased, actually gave speeches. One of Hamas's leaders gave speeches about the possibility of a multi-front war against Israel. I think it was back in February or March of last year. So there was a discussion and there were preparations for a possible scenario. But of course, it happened not the way Israel thought of it. It happened with our weakest enemy, Hamas in Gaza, and in a quite horrific way. And this has changed everything. This made Gaza for the first time a priority. Because I didn't think it wasn't exactly a joke, but I used to say that Israel talks about fighting Iran, prepares for war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and ends up fighting Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza every few years. This isn't the case. There was something much more massive happening in Gaza, and of course it got extremely more complicated because the IDF screwed up, because this was such a military and intelligence fiasco, and it ended in one day in 1,200 Israeli lives lost, and then the hostages as well. This became a huge issue. Now, the question is, what do we want from Gaza? Netanyahu keeps on talking of complete victory. And in my view, and I wrote that many times in Haaretz during the last 2 months, this is absolute nonsense. There's no way of achieving a complete victory against fighting a terrorist organization, which is deeply rooted and supported by a large part of the Palestinian population. And you can't do it within 2 weeks or 1 month. Netanyahu keeps saying that we're one step away from complete victory. This is not the case. It's much more complicated than that. I think we discussed that in our previous meetings and maybe in some of the podcasts and webinars and so on. The IDF has done quite well in Gaza. It fought Hamas. It defeated Hamas in many places. It killed more than 10,000 terrorists. This is quite impressive, but we haven't defeated them yet. And we're stuck. It's a strategic quagmire right now. There's only one IDF brigade still in Gaza in what is known as the corridor, which is cuts Gaza in half, and we actually prevent Palestinian population from returning to the northern part of the Gaza Strip, which is mostly destroyed because of the fighting going on there for months and months. The question right now is what to do next. Netanyahu keeps promising that he'll go for Rafah. Rafah is now his, I don't know, his promised land, so to speak. And at one point or another, we'll defeat the remaining 4 battalions of Hamas and victory will be achieved. Of course, and he knows that. He has a brilliant strategic mind. He knows that this is very different, that the reality is different. The question is how to handle, as you said, all those different fronts, Gaza, Iran, Lebanon. Now, on Gaza, I mentioned that briefly before. The president and the administration are not happy about Israeli actions. They're fed up with Netanyahu's refusal to discuss the day after. And they're also very, very critical of the way Israel handled humanitarian aid. I think Dr. Efron's article addresses most of these issues. And of course, they're extremely frustrated by Israeli mistakes, such as the attack on this convoy in late March. Now, the end result of all of that is that while Israel wants the hostages back and perhaps the defeat of Hamas, it's gotten very, very hard to coordinate with the Americans. We want the hostages back. The Americans want Israel out of Gaza. They want massive humanitarian aid. And Israel is left with no leverage over Hamas in order to force Hamas to agree to our demands. On top of everything else, we just got the response from Hamas to the mediators' suggestions, and Hamas is getting tougher and tougher demands. Why? Because it understands that Israel is otherwise occupied with Iran, that Israel has no way of pressuring Hamas right now, and Sinwar feels rather good about himself. He's hiding somewhere in the tunnels. He hasn't seen the light of day or the sun for 6 months. And yet he survives, and he's a survivor more than anything else. It's about survival for him. It's not about achieving complete victory. He knows that he can't achieve something like that.
Yeah, and you're referring to the reports, I think, this morning that suggested Hamas was only willing to release as many as 20 rather than 40 hostages, and a whole host of other terms that were far harsher than what the mediators had been suggesting thus far.
Yeah, David, if I may, one more point about that, because this is it's emotional for me and for many Israelis. I attended the latest protest in Kaplan Street in Tel Aviv on Saturday night, and this was about the hostages. And I didn't go to these protests for demonstrations for about 6 months because I felt problematic about this. I'm a reporter as well. It's another issue. It's another dilemma. But I felt a moral dilemma here because I felt that although I identified with the plight of the hostages' families and so on, what if I'm helping Hamas by going to the demonstration? And I was there on Saturday night, and it was quite clear. I knew by then that the Iranians were about to strike, and you could feel the frustration, the desperation in the air, because people there know that their loved ones are dying in Gaza, that there's no solution right now, that Hamas is not about to reach a solution on the one hand, and that on the other hand, nothing is going to be done about this because there's no path forward right now about the hostage problem. So this is desperate. This is a huge issue for Israel. This is not the Shalit case with one soldier kidnapped in 2006. These are 133 people. This is, for such a small country, this is a huge deal.
Of course. I want to begin to take some of the many questions that we've received and remind the audience, if you have a question, to type it in the Q&A box. We do have some that are around similar themes, but I want to take one anonymous attendee who asks, with the military intelligence having gotten it so wrong in predicting that Iran would not respond directly to the April 1st assassination of its top IRGC general, how can the government make an informed decision of how Iran will respond to an Israeli counterattack now?
Touché. Yeah, that's a great point. And it goes back to October 7th, because the military intelligence and Shin Bet, our domestic security services, got it wrong regarding Hamas's intentions there. You remember what you heard. I bet your last visit in Israel was somewhere around the summer of 2023. And what you heard from Israeli officials was that Hamas was deterred, Hamas was weakened after previous rounds of violence, and that Hamas was mostly about receiving more money to secure better life for the residents of Gaza. Well, we got our wake-up call on October 7th. And then on top of this, you have their mistake regarding April 1st. Again, it's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future, okay? It's hard to do. No, all analysts get it wrong. All reporters and journalists do. All intelligence people as well. And yet they underestimated what the Iranian response should be. And I have to add to that the base of the relations is not good right now. There's huge tensions between Netanyahu and the army over two things. One is passing the blame for the fiasco on October 7th, and one, which is even older than that, has to do with the judicial overhaul. Remember, when Netanyahu pushed forward and there were all those protests of the Miluimniks, of the reservists, there was a huge crisis between Netanyahu and the top brass of the army, because they warned him about the possible consequences. And he actually received 4 different warnings in writing from military intelligence telling him they didn't know that Hamas was about to strike. They said, look, because of our domestic crisis, our enemies see us as weak, and at one point or another during the next year or so, there will be hell to pay because of that. And of course, this is something that the Netanyahu crowd doesn't mention a lot, because it doesn't portray him in a very good way. But this is part of the reason why there's such tension between the prime minister and the intelligence community.
Yeah, I mean, we have a number of questions that are asking exactly that, which is Netanyahu's political interests amidst concerns that he was acting more and more out of political interest in the national interest vis-a-vis Gaza. Is there any concern about how Netanyahu's decision-making here may be driven by political concerns? How does politics weigh in on this moment?
First of all, I think the concern is at the White House. It's not broadcasted directly, but there's some of this is an understatement. This is a term that's not known to Israelis. But if you look at the messages from the White House and the administration, it's quite clear that they have in mind a worst case scenario that Netanyahu has been dreaming for years, that the United States would strike the Iranian nuclear sites. And I think that they have their suspicions whether Netanyahu, is there a possibility that the prime minister would take advantage of the situation, make it more complicated, and then rely on American help to strike the nuclear sites? This is the great dream for Netanyahu's crowd. I don't think it's in the cards. I don't think this would evolve that way. I may be, of course, quite wrong on that. Then you have the politics. A large amount of the Israelis, a large percentage of the Israelis do not trust Netanyahu, would not vote for him according to the polls, and are suspicious about his intentions right now. And he hasn't performed in a brilliant way since the fiasco of October 7th, which, as I said, happened on his watch. It was the army has to share a lot of the blame. Shin Bet does as well, but it's also, again, there's Netanyahu's responsibility here. And this has affected his decision-making regarding Gaza. Will it go all the way towards, I don't know, a final battle with Iran in order to prevent him from losing office? I find it hard to imagine right now, but it may have to do with the limits of my imagination. It's a very volatile question politically, and I was just sent some of the recent public opinion polls, which show that the Israeli public is absolutely divided about what needs to be done regarding Iran. And this has to do with the concern over Netanyahu's motives. And that wasn't the case. There were discussions 10 and 12 years ago. You remember Meir Dagan, Ehud Barak, quite a lot of people were critical of Netanyahu's intentions and strategies then. It's now much more serious than that because he's not, he's less popular, and a lot of people blame him for what happened in the last 6 months.
Yeah, numerous questions came in about, does this make elections less likely in the near term more likely? But it sounds like you're saying it's a little too early to know.
It depends. If war breaks with Iran and Hezbollah, nobody would go to elections soon. And Netanyahu's number one priority is staying in office by any means necessary. And if he can prevent elections, this is what he's going to do. He's consolidated his majority. There are 64 seats that are the hardline coalition, if you like, the right wing, Likud, and the ultra-Orthodox parties. And he'll stick to them as much as he can. Part of the tragedy right now, from my view, is that many of the right strategic decisions are not taken because of the limitations of this government. Some of the things that Netanyahu, as a statesman, could have done in the past, he's not willing to afford right now, to afford himself, because he fears losing the support of Ben Gvir and Smotrich. And these guys have their own calculations. Ben Gvir is extremely popular, especially among the youth right now. This is a sort of a traumatic reaction to all these terrible atrocities that we've witnessed from the Palestinian side. While Smotrich, who allied himself with Ben Gvir before the last elections, is actually very unpopular right now. So both of them have their own motives for disbanding the government at one point or another.
Amos, I'm not sure how much you could share, but we have a number of questions, I'd say a batch of questions that are about the Saudi role and the growing Saudi normalization, and another about Jordan and its role. And I'm not sure what you can speak about, or about the role of those countries in this weekend's.
Okay, David, I'll do what I can. I have to tell you something that many of you are familiar with, that there are military censorship rules regarding the press in Israel. It's a free press. I can criticize the government as much as I want, and if you read the Haaretz, you can see that I do this quite constantly. On the other hand, there are certain issues that deal with Israel's national security that I can't discuss completely freely. These are the rules I have to play accordingly. So I'll quote Western and Arab media regarding that. It's quite clear that there was help from the Jordanians and from the Saudis and from some of the Gulf states, friendly Sunni states, if you will. Now, how many of these countries actually intercepted Iranian drones? They're now trying to keep a distance from the results because the Iranians are threatening them naturally. But about 3 years ago, the Biden administration came up with something that was called MEAD, a Middle East Air Defense initiative. And that meant that there will be sensors like radars all over the place, all over the Gulf and the Middle East with friendly nations, and they will share their intelligence and their information regarding possible move of rockets being launched to any of those countries. And it's quite clear whether it's from Yemen, whether it's from Lebanon, whether it's from Syria. And it's quite clear that the Saudis are part of this alliance, and that a lot of it has been done recently. Look at all those projects launched towards Israel from Yemen and so on. We know that those were intercepted, some of them over Saudi Arabia soil, some of them in the Red Sea and so on. So it's quite clear that these countries are joining together to deal with that. I think that this was actually gradually, this is progress during the war, and the most significant event was on Saturday. And I think this is extremely important. Again, Israel would try not to speak about that publicly, not to spoil this secret relationship, but it sends a message. It doesn't mean that if war breaks out with Iran, Saudi planes and UAE planes would attack Iran. This is not the case. It's not going to happen. But the fact that those countries see Iran as the big threat and see Israel as a friend to some extent and are willing to cooperate behind the scenes, this is massive. And I think the Biden administration is building its hopes on that, saying, if this Saturday night was so impressive, maybe we can build on that and reach, for instance, this normalization deal that we've been talking about for ages between Israel and the Saudis and so on. This would have materialized if the war in Gaza had not started. And some of the explanations for Hamas's reason for attack is that the Hamas wanted to spoil that they were in panic. Both Hamas and their Iranian minders were in panic that this would succeed and that this would push the Palestinian case to the end of the list, of the end of the Middle Eastern agenda. And I think that in a way, Sinwar managed to spoil that. I think that otherwise, probably by December, we would have been speaking of open relationship between, out in the open, some kind of diplomatic relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now it's much harder to do, even though there's a shared interest. The Saudis need to show that something has been done for the plight of the Palestinians. They need the PA on board. They need some kind of a solution for the day after in Gaza. And all of these things, as I explained, are very hard for Netanyahu to do, considering the political circumstances at home.
It seems a bit of a paradox. I'm curious if you could speak to the mood of the Israeli public after a weekend in which it was so very clear that the relationship with the United States and the partnership with regional allies was so critical for Israel's security. It kind of challenges the notion that only Israel's security can only be ensured by Israel, for Israel. Israel can only stand alone and must stand alone in defending its enemies. And I wonder if, has the Israeli reporting and the Israeli public, are they coming away with the message of this is a demonstration of the mighty IDF, or are they coming away with the view that this demonstrates the importance of regional cooperation?
It depends. It's a hugely complicated issue, and the man on the street, so to speak, is not aware of all these nuances. In the end, people know that Americans are their friends. People appreciate President Biden's help. I think he's extremely popular among most mainstream Israelis. There is this phenomena of our local extreme version of Fox News, which is Channel 14, which is the Bibi channel, the TV station, which is quite popular. and is fully supportive of Netanyahu and very, very aggressive towards Biden for a very long time. You have all these fear mongers, all kinds of conspiracy theorists and so on, and they've been attacking him constantly. And they're having a problem with reality right now because, again, the president helped us on October. You remember the famous don't speech and then sending in those aircraft carriers and so on. And he helped us again, even more significantly in recent days. Are people fully aware of that? I'm not sure. What I tried to explain in my two long articles in Haaretz recently is that, again, this is part of the issue. It's very important that the United States is helping us, but in a way, we're losing some of our freedom to decide. All of this, what you mentioned, Israel would defend itself by itself with American help. Well, it's mostly, more than anything else, it's American help first, and then Israelis defending themselves, but not by themselves. And that's a big deal. Does that leave us absolutely free to decide where we're heading, what we're doing? The evidence it isn't out yet. The jury isn't out yet. We'll have to see how well Netanyahu performs under these circumstances. And again, I think anyone who understands what's going on is deeply appreciative of the American role here. It's extremely important. Look at those. I just saw on Israeli TV there was Prime Minister Sunak in British Parliament praising the brave British pilots helping save lives, meaning Israeli lives, and then President Biden speaking with pilots and telling them, American pilots, and telling them that you're the best in the world. This is impressive. This is something that I have to say I'm deeply touched because this was dangerous, and we had our friends helping us here. It's always complicated, but it's also quite optimistic.
And it reminds me, I mean, I imagine the Israeli public has not gone so far as to discuss how this regional coalition could be enhanced vis-a-vis the Palestinian issue. But it does seem that, we've spoken for years about, even going back to the vision of Rabin to address the Palestinian file in order to maintain a coalition against Iran as a genuine threat. Do you expect any of that to begin to increase the discourse that there needs to be some cooperation with the Americans and the regional players vis-a-vis Gaza and the West Bank in order to maintain that coalition? Or are we simply not ready for that in Israel for that kind of conversation?
I'd like to say yes, but I'm afraid I'll say more or less a no. It's the right thing to do. It's the right path forward. It makes sense strategically, even though I'm not, I have no illusions about the Palestinians. But you have, and you've been here since October 7th. I think the people who haven't or are going to travel to Israel and so on, I think what they have to understand is that the events, the massacre, has rocked Israeli society to its core. It has shaken everything we believed in. This whole ethos of the IDF coming, we've talked about that, you and me, in the past. This ethos of the IDF soldiers coming to help you. A mother with children texting urgently while she's bleeding to death in a kibbutz near Gaza. This tragedy, first of all, it shocked the public, and much of the public has lost faith in decision makers, in generals, and even in the IDF at large. But even more than that, it made us extremely pessimistic and suspicious about the Palestinians. One cannot hide this truth. There's a huge anti-Arab and especially anti-Palestinian sentiment. And this has to do with, people talking of revenge, and we've seen some cases of retaliation in Gaza as well. These are very ugly emotions, but you can understand where this is coming from. Anyone who's seen the actual videos or the actual sites of the destroyed houses in the kibbutzim or the bodies of people who went to the Nova Festival and so on. First of all, there's a level of hatred and some sense of revenge, but also there's a deep suspicion of the other side. Can peace be reached with them? You've heard the sentiment, something that I can't justify, but soldiers coming back from Gaza and saying that there are no innocents in Gaza. Most Israelis didn't speak that way before October 7th. So this is something that you can't ignore. There's a lot of well-wishers who really believe in Israel and support it from Washington and New York and so on, but they need to understand that the public has been transformed and that it will get very, very hard to persuade the public to move forward regarding the Palestinians or to take any more risks. I think this was again, this goes back to this engagement, the Sharon decision in 2005. Those kibbutzim, and they supported this engagement, and they were the most peace-supporting people in the nation. The people in the kibbutzim demonstrated against Netanyahu on a weekly basis, and many of them were helping Palestinians entering Israel in order to, and driving them to Palestinian families from Gaza to Israeli hospitals. This is the way they felt ideologically. And they've experienced the worst kind of atrocities. And I think this leaves a deep scars on the Israeli psyche, and I think it will affect the way people see the chances for peace and the willingness to risk, to make concessions under these circumstances.
Yeah, and I think, lost in all the, enormity of news, and with the vis-a-vis Iran and Gaza, of course, is the rising tensions in the West Bank, where we saw 2 Palestinians and, of course, the 14-year-old boy murdered amidst rising West Bank tensions and riots and all the rest. Are you following that amidst all of this? Is the Israeli public following that amidst all this? And I wonder if you could say a word about where the West Bank stands today after a week of heightened tensions that haven't been so much in the news, but otherwise probably would be.
I'm following this in a limited way. Most of the Israeli public is not aware of that at all, except for the case of the 14-year-old Jewish boy who was murdered in a very violent and vicious way in one of those outposts near Ramallah. Since then, there are reports of no less than 5 Palestinians killed by Israeli settlers. The right wing would tell you this was self-defense and so on, but in some cases, I assume that this was retaliation and not only self-defense. And it gets very, very heated right now. It's not top priority because of everything else going on right now. But what we saw on October 7th as well is that while everybody's attention is diverted elsewhere, this is exactly the time when there's more violence and more extreme violence between settlers and their Palestinian neighbors. So this is also deeply troubling right now. And there's always this sense that we could have another front. Remember those multi-front scenarios that I mentioned: Lebanon, Iran, Syria, West Bank and Gaza and so on. We'll have to see if this blows out completely. I don't know where this is heading, but this is troubling as well. And I know that the IDF Stop Ras is also concerned about that, and on top of everything else that they're bothered with right now.
Another thing for the United States and Israel to discuss and coordinate around. Amos, I want to thank you for this real exceptional download on all that's happened this weekend and what may happen in the days to come. And just thank you for all the time that you've spent over the last 6 months helping to inform the Israel Policy Forum community. And I really appreciate your time to be with us.
Thank you, David, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you all. And of course, I welcome you all, if you're not already, to make sure to sign up for Israel Policy Forum updates. Please consider supporting our work, following us on all your favorite social media channels. And please be sure to check out Shira Efron's latest piece in Foreign Affairs on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I really do believe it's one of the most comprehensive and informative articles on the subject that have really been published to date, and highly recommend that, which is based on a research report she has done on that subject. There will be more to come from Israel Policy Forum in the days and weeks to come. Please be sure to follow us in all of your various locations. And thank you all once again for joining us.